listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis. And this week we have an UnCharitable special, which doesn't mean that we're just going around being uncharitable. It's all about the documentary film UnCharitable, which came out towards the end of last year in the US, directed by Gyllenhaal. And based on the work of Dan Pallotta, particularly a TED Talk and a book that he's written about his experiences and his kind of arguments about the need to overcome what he calls the overhead myth, which we'll talk more about in a moment. And so I was lucky enough to get a random offer out of the blue, actually, as a result of this very podcast, from Lara Muth at Vitol Foundation, who I have to say a big thank you to. And they offered me the opportunity to see the film, and that actually turned into an opportunity to do a little sort of private screening at their offices, which I did. So I invited along some people, most of whom were kind of already friends of mine from the philanthropy world, to come and watch the film, just have a bit of a talk about it, see what we made of it, and a few of them also did a couple of sort of short mini interviews that you'll hear at the end of this podcast. So I wasn't quite sure how to structure the podcast because it's a bit of a departure from the normal running order. The main event is still an interview, so I was very lucky to get an interview with the director, Gyllenhaal, so that's the kind of main body of things. But I thought before we go into that, I would just give a few framing thoughts and maybe just a little bit of analysis of the film, just so that you kind of know what it's about and, you know, what I thought of it and the sort of sense in the room when I watched it. Then we'll hear from Stephen. It's really interesting. I think, he kind of touches on lots of points about the ideas in the film, but also the process of making it and what the plans are next in terms of taking, the ideas in the film forward. And then after that, we'll have a few of those kind of short vox pop interviews with people who attended the screening. So we'll hear from Natasha Friend from Camden Giving, from Angela Kail from NPC, Amy Braier, my colleague at Pears Foundation, and from Ruo Wu and Alison Talbot at the law firm Winckworth Sherwood, all of whom came along to the event and very kindly gave up a bit of their time afterwards to give some thoughts. So before we get into the interview with Stephen, I'm just going to, as I say, kind of give a few framing thoughts and kind of my initial take on the film, and I'll try not to go too long on this. So I guess the basic thing to say is my overarching point is I definitely would recommend that if you get a chance to see the film, that you do so. Particularly, if you work in the world of philanthropy or charity, it's a real opportunity to see a proper, very well-made documentary film all about issues to do with philanthropy and charity, which is, definitely unusual, and certainly that itself is not something to be sniffed at. I found it, really watchable as well. I think it's kind of really interesting and well made. There are definitely some points to make, about it that I will come on to in a moment that people in the room when we watched it made, and also ones that kind of occurred to me. But I should say it's not on general release at the moment, although as you'll hear when I talk to Stephen, there are kind of plans, hopefully, to make it more widely available. So, over time, I think it will become easier, and there are lots of sort of screening events being held by various non-profit organisations and philanthropy bodies in various places around the world. So if you do get a chance, I would definitely say, seek it out. As I say, kind of the response in the room when I held the screening that I held was a bit mixed in a way. I think everybody kind of thought that the film was worth seeing. Some really liked it, and it really kind of resonated with them, and they, appreciated the message and thought it kind of really had an impact. Others, I think, found the bits of it that they didn't like sort of more difficult to swallow, and as a result kind of were more ambivalent about the film overall. I guess, for me, the good stuff about the film first, let's cover that off, because there is a lot of good stuff about it. I actually ended up watching the film twice. I watched it once on the train because I wasn't sure when I was going to speak to Stephen, and I wanted to prep for that. So I watched it once on the train on my own on a laptop, and I found it really interesting. As I say, I think it's kind of really well put together. It kind of stacks up there against a lot of the documentaries that you'll find out there on streaming platforms, now, and good use of various bits of kind of archive footage and that sort of thing, and some interesting stories and kind of narratives woven throughout it. I guess some people who watched it in the room said maybe it was a little bit, overlong, and particularly, if the ambition longer term is to get it out to a wider public audience, 90 minutes of this might be a bit of a stretch. I don't know, because I think the appetite for documentaries these days, given that people kind of watch all kinds of things on streaming services and platforms, potentially people would. And as I say, it's quite a gripping narrative once you get into it. And, actually managing to make what is essentially a pretty niche issue about philanthropy, the idea that kind of focusing on overheads as a metric of success is not a good idea, something that kind of resonates potentially with the average person in the street is pretty remarkable. As we'll see in a moment, I think, in order to do that, it's necessary to sort of focus quite a lot on individual stories, and that in itself brings some challenges. But I guess the other kind of overarching points about it that are really good is that the central thematic points that it's making are really important. You might not necessarily agree entirely with the way in which they're framed or some of the conclusions that are drawn, but the idea that focusing on overheads, is not a good thing to do, and that actually, supporting non-profits and charities through providing them with core costs and kind of allowing them to flourish. I don't know that there are that many people who would disagree with that, even as I say, the specific framing within UnCharitable they might take issue with. Some of the other points it makes about additional factors like the limitations on time frames in the non-profit world, so the expectation that you need to deliver immediate results, and that actually that's kind of unfair when often in the commercial sphere people are given a relatively long time in order to kind of demonstrate the value of something. And linked to that, the fact that this then leads to an atmosphere in which taking risks is difficult, and that's problematic, given that surely the point of philanthropy is that we should aim high, and if we're genuinely aiming to sort of have an impact on really significant challenges of the sort that are facing humanity at the moment, the climate crisis, global inequality, poverty, world hunger, that kind of thing, then we do need to not stop, we need to stop fiddling around the edges and just addressing the symptoms of problems and kind of more fundamentally address their underlying causes. And that's certainly a point that was made in the film. I think it's one that's a slightly kind of left on the table. It's not something that's kind of delved into as much as it possibly could be, because it's not the centerpiece of the film, but there is some interesting stuff in there about that. And some stuff I really liked about the necessity for using our kind of collective imagination to envision possible futures and to work towards those, which I thought were, I find that kind of stuff made me quite optimistic. I'm not necessarily by nature given to that sort of optimism. But just to come on to a few sort of critical points upon the film, and I should say up front here, I'm not just ragging on the movie. It's just, if you're sitting there thinking, right, what can I critically say about this? It's often easier to point out things that don't work, or questions that it raises, or omissions or flaws. So take this in that spirit. I guess one question is a practical one about who is the documentary or the film actually aimed at. I know the ambition, and you'll hear when you hear Stephen talking, is that it's sort of to get out to the widest possible audience. But I think people in the room when we were watching it were sort of saying, well, it feels a little bit like it falls slightly between an audience of people within the non-profit and philanthropy world who probably already know all this stuff and are minded to agree with the basic points, and then are just going to focus on the things that they don't necessarily agree with specifically, and a kind of general mass audience of the public for whom it still seems maybe a little bit of a stretch to get them to engage with these issues. And does that mean that it's sort of difficult to know exactly who this is aimed at? I guess the point some people made was, well, there's still a pretty large bulk of people who are interested in philanthropy or non-profits or charities, but haven't necessarily got to the point where they know all these points about the challenges and around issues to do with overhead. So, whether those are philanthropists or funders or charity trustees, actually them seeing this film might be hugely valuable. So I think, there is definitely an audience out there, and potentially it could be a wider audience. And again, in practical terms, as I said before, there's that distribution question. At the moment, you do have to quite actively go and seek this film out, because it's only being kind of shown where there are screenings being hosted by mostly kind of non-profit organisations. And that might all then change if this gets eventually some sort of public release on a streaming platform, and then, the theory of whether this appeals to the general public can be tested. I think another point that occurred to me when I was watching the film, and other people picked up on it, and it's something I talked to Stephen quite a bit about, and he's got some interesting things to say, is about that balance between the kind of systemic issues that the film is trying to raise and the individual stories that it's trying to tell as a way of getting that across. And this struck me as interesting because it felt as though whenever we're talking about philanthropy, there are systemic issues. But if you want to get a wider audience to engage with them, you have to go in at the level of the individual and tell those individual human stories. And as Stephen says, that's what all documentary filmmaking is really about. You have to kind of bring people along by focusing in on those human stories. I guess the question is just how do you make sure you maintain that balance so that the sort of the human interest in the individual story doesn't end up overshadowing the systemic issue and sort of making it so that people lose sight in that. And I guess linked to that, another thing that maybe there was a little bit of unease about in terms of some people watching the film was the stories that are told in the film maybe reflect a slight lack of diversity in that it feels quite male particularly and quite white. I mean, yes, there are other voices in there. So Dory McWhirter, for instance, is featured, Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation, Rudy Espinosa, and others, and they're not white men, but they're also not the main characters. They're more sort of there as commentators. I mean, Dory McWhirter is in there telling her story, but crucially, none of those people are the ones who are featured as sort of telling their story of having been shot down in the same way that Dan Pallotta was. All of the people telling those stories are essentially white men, which again is not a problem. It might just so happen the handful of stories that they have are, ones where the people involved are white men, but the focus on their individual narratives, it means that the film ends up walking, I think, an even finer line where it's using those stories to kind of illustrate a wider systemic issue, or it's almost sort of falling into portraying these people as martyrs, and then that starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable at points. So I think, that is something that when you're watching the film, I think mostly the balance is okay, and it kind of just about gets there, but there are definitely points where it could have lapsed, I think, into just kind of telling a sort of victim complex story about what happened to these people. I guess a couple of other things. The film is relatively US focused, and as a result, it kind of is relatively US centric. I don't think that matters too much in that the issues in their general points are relatively universal. I mean, things about the challenges around philanthropic funding and core costs and overheads and that sort of thing, that definitely resonates in the UK, and I'm sure it resonates in a lot of other places. But there are sort of specifics to the way that the US non-profit world works that maybe don't translate as well. There's also bits where maybe it's slightly culturally jarring. I'm not sure a British audience is quite as minded to go with the really, really sort of upbeat, stirring parts of the narrative as a US audience was. And I would be genuinely interested to know whether an American audience is more tolerant of the bits where Dan Pallotta sits down and plays his guitar than the audience in the room that I was sitting in were, but who all found that fairly cringesome, I have to say. Another sort of more serious point that was made by some people is that the focus of the film is on a sort of handful of bigger non-profit organisations. What isn't really covered is how these issues relate to kind of grassroots organisations, or indeed their recipients, or kind of end beneficiaries, and that maybe feels like a bit of an admission as well. Another point that occurred to me was understandably, given the story that is being told, there's a certain part of the film that it contains kind of attacks on the media for perpetuating narratives about non-profits and sort of shooting down these figures that were taking maybe sort of slightly unorthodox approaches to trying to drive growth and success, which relied on, investing a lot in fundraising and marketing and that kind of thing. I think some of that is fair enough. I always slightly have an issue when people just go, say, oh, it's the media's all awful. And maybe that's because I'm married to a former journalist who runs a journalism department. But I always sort of question whether it's quite easy sometimes to just go, oh, it's all the media's fault. And actually just being aware that the media does get a lot of things wrong, and it often does, represent these things in ways that are unhelpful, but it's not always just, as easy as it's the media's fault for misrepresenting these things. I think there's, question about, why it is that the media reflects on these narratives, because most media reporting tends to reflect narratives that are already there. And the question then is sort of, why are these narratives already there? I think a couple of other things. I mean, one very, very specific historical thing that rankled with me, which I have to mention, although this is quite niche, has to be said. There's one point in which Dan Pallotta particularly bases his argument about why it is that everything's broken in the non-profit sector and the way in which we think about charities is dead wrong, where he argues that it essentially all goes back to Puritan thinking on charity, and, the idea that you were allowed to make money on the one hand, but then you had to sort of do good as a way of absolving the sin of making money, and you couldn't make money in the course of doing that good, so the two things had to be kept entirely separate. A few things to say about that. I mean, my understanding is, from reading around on this, I think some scholars of history would argue that's a relatively narrow characterization of how the Puritans actually thought about these things. I think also the assumption that that's the primary or sole basis for modern views about charity seems a bit tenuous. Even if it's true to some extent, that's one element of the film that's very US centric. Presumably the thinking in the UK about charities isn't shaped solely by Puritans, particularly because they all left to go to the US, so they didn't end up having quite so much of an influence on the way we think about charity over here. But that being said, we still have just as much of a tradition of people questioning the legitimacy of spending on overheads within charity. So it must be coming from somewhere else, not just the Puritans. So I think, that's something that's certainly worth bearing in mind. A couple of other quick things. I think one is that a few people and commentators, when writing about Pallotta's views, have sort of said, actually, his fundamental argument about it being mistaken to focus on overheads is right in some senses, but the way in which it's presented potentially is a little bit misleading sometimes, and maybe even unhelpful, because a lot of things get lumped together as overhead. And that's true in terms of how, donors who are doing this stuff wrong think about overhead. They lump things together as well, and that is part of the problem. But then in presenting that problem, Pallotta himself sort of then argues that all of the things that are included in overhead, should be seen as fine. And actually, if you are going to lump together things, as kind of wildly diverse as staff salaries, expenditure on office costs, but also investment in fundraising and marketing, that in a way maybe is kind of obscuring the issue a little bit. So I guess the other point is that some people have pointed out, actually, in quite a lot of cases, spending on advertising and marketing is actually counted as program expenditure if it's directly mission related. So the idea that all of this stuff is separate and somehow being kind of held up as overhead is not actually true in all instances, and so that's kind of important. Another point that I think is important, and this is something that Stephen Gyllenhaal talks about quite a bit, and was really interesting that he did so, is that obviously the flip side to the whole problem with the overhead myth, and this is what I've always thought about it, is why is it that donors and funders end up focusing on overheads? It's not just because they really, really love the idea of overheads as a metric. It's because they don't have anything else that can tell them, can give them a sense that the money that they're putting towards issues is having an effect, and can kind of give them that warm glow or that sense of being sure that their money's being spent well that they need. And maybe that's because we haven't developed those measures of impact or the ways of telling stories that kind of fill that gap. And so people end up looking around for things that can kind of reassure them, and they alight on proxies such as how much is spent on overheads, how much does this organisation spend on salaries, etc., that maybe aren't as helpful as all that. And actually, if we were able to tell better stories about what was achieved with the money, we might not have the same issues with people focusing on overhead. And then finally, I guess the the other point that's been made about the film and about sort of Dan Pallotta's arguments more broadly is that his kind of solution to this problem around the fact that, you know, charities are held, or non-profits are held to kind of unreasonable standards when compared to businesses or for-profit organizations, or kind of at a disadvantage because they're not treated in the same way, is to say, actually, well, charities should just be more business-like, and, you know, that we should treat the two in the same way. And I think that does belie a kind of underlying ideological point, which is there's a sort of belief in capitalism and markets as the primary or the most successful way of driving forward change that's definitely exhibited in what he says and his sort of underlying things in the film. And that, you know, there are plenty of people who would agree with his analysis of the problem, but definitely wouldn't agree with his diagnosis for the solution. And they would say, actually, no, that's the last thing that we need to do. What we need to do is, you know, change capitalism and change the way we think about, you know, how we value for-profit, and actually, you know, or treat non-profits differently, but have measures of value that kind of acknowledge that they are different. So I think, you know, that is definitely something to be aware of as well. And then linked to that is the fact that because of that sort of dogmatic belief in the value of the state, there is definitely a slight underplaying of the role of this. In the value of the market, there is an underplaying of the role of the state in all of this. So again, you know, there's a sort of sense within the film that if we can just get non-profits, you know, bigger by spending more on fundraising and marketing, that's how we're going to solve all of these huge problems. Whereas, you know, in reality, it's definitely going to involve governmental, action as well. And that doesn't really come into the film, except implicitly in that there's one of the things that struck me that is quite odd is when making a case about the need to sort of think big, and to allow charities to grow and thrive in the way required to allow them to think big and to act big. One of the examples that gets leaned on is the Apollo space program and the role that NASA played in it. And if that's the example of sort of dreaming big and acting big, I mean, surely that's a sort of paradigm example of the limitations of the market and the non-profit sphere and the necessity for government, but it doesn't get presented as such. So I just, you know, that was a bit peculiar to me. But anyway, those are just some thoughts about the film. As I say, hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of why it's interesting. Hopefully it makes you want to go out and see it, because as I say, you know, that's my kind of fundamental point, is that I would definitely recommend that you do that. Okay, well, at this point, without further ado, let's hear from Stephen Gyllenhaal, the director of UnCharitable. I should say it was great to have a chance to sit down with Stephen. He clearly is a raconteur and somebody who is used to sort of speaking. Because unlike a lot of the interviews that I've previously done, I will say something at the beginning and then you won't hear from me for roughly 20 to 25 minutes, because Stephen just sort of then did a very interesting monologue for that first part of the interview. And I do wonder if that's actually partly because his experience of putting together documentaries is that's kind of what you do. You get people to just sort of speak and then you give them some little prompts, but then allow them just to kind of extemporize on the basis that you're going to kind of use bits of that later. Anyway, that's what happened, and then I come back in and ask them a couple more questions. But it was a really, really interesting conversation. So without further ado, let's go into that, and then I will be back after that to introduce a couple of the mini interviews from people who watched the film with me. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Stephen Gyllenhaal. Hi there, Stephen.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's great to have a chance to talk to you on the podcast. Obviously, we're here to talk about the film, which came out towards the end of last year and is sort of slowly making its way across the Atlantic to the UK. And I was lucky enough to see it very recently, UnCharitable. Really great just to kind of hear a bit from you about what it was that got you involved in this project in the first place, because obviously the kind of the thinking that underpins it's been around for a while. So it'd be really interesting to hear kind of what brought you to it and what kind of got you enthused about the idea.
Well, I had zero interest or zero knowledge about the philanthropic sector at all, or its problems, or its controversies, or anything. Zero. And I'm not entirely delighted to say that while I did a little bit of charity because I was in Hollywood and blah, 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 I really was much more intent on raising a family and making movies. And for me, I believed that the movies I made were enough of a charitable act. Some of them very violent. Nonetheless, I felt they were a charitable act anyway. So I had no motivation or good intention for getting involved with this documentary, except that I knew Dan Pallotta very, very well. And he'd been a friend for years. And I knew he'd done something or other. The thing I knew about him was we had met and we sort of connected at various meetings and things like that. I didn't really understand even what the AIDS riots were. I mean, I sort of knew about AIDS and all that. I knew he dressed really well. He was a really good dresser. And I always dressed like not so great. A film director, if you dress in a coat and tie, there's something wrong with you. If you're in jeans and a T-shirt, you're probably a creative. So I was always dressed like not so great. But I did want to dress a little better. My kids were growing older. I needed to look more adult. So I would talk about, where'd you get your shoes? And what did you do about this and that? And also we were very aligned about deeper issues as well. Not that it was a totally superficial relationship, although I was impressed with his superficiality in terms of his style. He had a really good style. So we had a lot of deep conversations and a lot of connections about a lot of things. And ultimately, and I'm not going to say why, because some people may see this podcast who have not seen the movie. So I don't want to give away the plot of someone. But he then left LA and moved to Boston for reasons that become clear in the movie, or relatively clear in the movie if you put two and two or three actually together. And we sort of lost track. He'd fly to LA every once in a while and we'd have lunch or something, but not much. During that period of time, I really moved. Well, I didn't move from narrative filmmaking. I'm primarily a narrative filmmaker, director, and producer, and writer, and blah blah blah. And so I was not in the nonprofit sector, except if a movie didn't do well. There was a point though when I made a documentary that I got very involved with called In Utero, which I produced, which was motivated by the fact that I was married again and I wanted to have another child. I did really well with my first two, had a great time. And we were having problems. And so I said, okay, why don't we make a documentary? Because I'm a privileged white guy and can get away with things that are probably not even, I'm glad. I wish everyone could do it. That's really what I feel. And they should. And thank God, just as a side, the iPhone, the technology now means that not just rich people can make movies. And we're really more and more beginning to see the impact of what the rest of humanity has a right to be saying. While some people bemoan all that, I'm cheering it on. Because in some ways, I think I had an inclination towards doing sort of good in a way. So I made this other documentary, In Utero. It was all about the science from conception to birth. And because that way, I said, well, let's talk to all the experts, because you can do that if you're a filmmaker. And we then really it became a very important documentary, and it has had a real serious impact in the prenatal and perinatal world. And in fact, has gotten me involved in a lot of other things around that psychology and so on and so forth. Well, there had been, it was right around the time An Inconvenient Truth had come out, or had come out a year or two earlier. Dan had done this TED Talk, and we had lunch, and he said, do you think there's a documentary to be made about what happened to me on the AIDS ride? Which I sort of half knew, not really all the details. I knew the last part of it, that he had been completely devastated and destroyed by what had happened, but I didn't really know any of the details. And I said, well, I don't know, it's a great kind of home movie thing, and I really care. And he was really devastated by it. And a lot of things, which I also won't talk about because they're in the movie, happened to him. But then he told me about two other people who had been through exactly the same thing, and what the dynamic was, become very, very successful, do very, very well. And as so is often the case, doing very well means thinking outside the box, doing things unconventionally. None of the things that were done by either Dan or anyone else was unconventional in the for-profit world, Hollywood or anything else. But in the nonprofit world, it was demonized, which I didn't really understand until we sort of dug into it. And at that point, I began to go, there's something here, thinking Yeah, we'll throw together a little documentary. I got an editor. We'll shoot some stuff. I'll shoot 3 or 4 interviews, and and it'll be fun. And Dan and I will spend some time together, and all that. 7 years later, the film was done. And what happened in between, actually, which is important, is that I now have a 9-year-old, thanks to the first film, in many ways, I think. And I had also I've loved film. Film saved my life. Cinema saved my life. There's just no question about it. Just the wonderful lack of, not lack of ethics, but the wonderful complication of human beings, how crazy we are and wonderful we are, is really certainly captured in literature and poetry and music to a certain extent. But movies, for me, captured it the best. And I was obsessed with movies for a certain point of my life. But as life went on, my kids grew up. They've done very well. It sort of has been my joy to watch having no idea that these little kids were going to become more sophisticated around filmmaking and incredibly capable of doing what I had also done, but even quantumly beyond that, which is what a parent is supposed to do. I really kind of lost interest in doing what you have to do to make a great movie, which is sacrifice everything. Also, I had a little kid, and this time I wanted to just hang with him and just be with him. And I had plenty of success. I didn't need any more. And I just really did sort of lose interest in the process. But making UnCharitable, although it was brutally hard, because it was all donations, I got a really good taste of what it's like to do charitable project. And, I didn't really ever conceive of it as a charitable project. I conceived it as something for Dan. I grew more and more interested in the drama of the characters. It was another series and I grew more and more clear that I was not so interested in the polemic of it or in even the message that Dan had. That message was pretty clear. I was much more interested as it went along with the emotional toll that it takes to try and do good, of how destructiveness works, why it works, why it is so successful to destroy what is good, why people do it, and the emotional journey that you can go through in a movie and experience that. And as that happened later and later in the process, I came back to loving movies. I came back to going, I am lucky enough, I have been privileged enough, really privileged, to have gained an understanding of cinema enough to have the possibility of making a movie that could really impact in a major way. And even as I was finishing the movie, and I became really difficult. So the problem was, I'm the director, and I want this. And there's only so much money, and the donors were freaking out about this, and that's too much money. How long is it taking? Why is it taking so long? You don't know what you're doing. I don't know what I'm doing. I've made 40 movies. Look at my IMDb list. You may not know what that is, but in Hollywood, that's like everything you've done. But still, just like with most donors, they know better about how to solve a problem, whether it's homelessness or whatever it is, than the people who are actually doing it. Pisses me off. Pissed me off about this, pissed me off more and more as I watched it happen to other people. In any case, as I began to really, near the end, understand, I didn't know what was going to happen with the movie, but that I was committed to this movie. As the director, I would go to the producer and say, I want this, 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 and this. And I want it. Now, I'd been through this a lot in my life with producers, and I've been at war with them. There was a problem with this. I was the producer. So I would go to me as a director, carry on with the producer, and the producer lost every time. The director won. And I got into more trouble with donors and everyone else and how long it was taking, but I wanted to get the thing right. So one of the things I owe to UnCharitable is I am back in the movie business again. And I'm 74 years old, and it's time for me to stop, but I'm not stopping. I'm back into it. Now, what has happened to the movie, I couldn't even hope for. I mean, I began to understand when we did screenings. You make a movie, you think, I don't know. I know me. I'm an idiot. There's a great quote I just heard. I got to find the quote. Let me find the quote real quick. I just heard this quote and I really like it. The quote is, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that it didn't work. Now, that's what my experience was. I made 10,000 mistakes. But those 10,000 mistakes meant don't go down that road. It also meant 10,000 mistakes meant donors were furious. Everyone was angry with me. But 10,001, or whatever, however you want to calculate the math, it began to become a movie now that I see works. And when something works when you're with an audience, and when you're not with an audience really, and you go through the process, you think you're an idiot. Oh, by the way, the quote was Thomas Edison. So I think what I'm seeing with the movie now, so here, now we get the movie done, we release it, we're going through the process of releasing it. It's a complicated process. Someone said, if you know how to release a movie 6 months ago, you don't know how to release a movie now, because everything's changing so fast. So what's happened with the movie is we're working our way through. Documentaries now are particularly difficult to get out in the world. There've been a lot of articles in Hollywood, newspapers about how impossible it is, and nothing's getting really picked up. And the streamers are only picking up things with celebrities and with murder, and things like charity is not high on their list. But it's impacting audiences. And what I'm seeing, what has happened since September 21st, when it was first released, and now, has been it has allowed for a door to open. Because of Dan, really, because of Dan's genius, and because of my 10,000 figuring out finally how the emotional arc worked. There's a kind of alchemy, I think I can say with confidence now, in the movie that gets people who are in the sector to go, oh my God, finally someone is saying what we've been kind of knowing, or we've known, couldn't quite put it into words, and now it's in a movie. And by the way, the movie cost a decent amount of money. Another reason why people were upset. And the distribution has cost a decent amount of money. Not all that much compared to the movie. I mean, but still, it's a decent amount of money. And I've said to people, that's because this sector deserves to have a first-class documentary. That's what it deserves. So, F you. Sort of. And everyone who sort of complains about it. So what has happened for me, and for, I think, what's going on now, which is what we're really going, there's the movie, we made the movie. There was the marketing of the movie, which we have sort of been in the process of, and is sort of now moving forward. There's an educational distribution. We're in some negotiation with streamers, but we want to be very careful that it works properly. We're now going globally with this, UK, other places too. We're still really focusing on the charitable sector, and it's been very, very well received there. With an understanding that the charitable sector becomes the champions for the movie beyond all that. And it may take some serious time for that all to happen. But what has happened beyond all that, which was not clear to me, was what is the call to action? When you see the movie, what is the call to action? And Dan had said all along, the call to action is tell everyone to see the movie. That'll change thinking. And I'm going, yeah, I get it. But first of all, it has the patina of being sort of self-interest. Have my movie seen by everybody, number one. And number two, it isn't enough. It's like, okay, you've seen the movie, you have everyone in the world's seen the movie. Okay, cool, that'd be great, But what do you do next? And almost before the movie was done, I think because it had re-engaged me, because I was working with great people. I mean, great people also cost money. I had one of the best animation houses in the world doing the animation. Did it for next to nothing, but it was still not cheap. Had a great editor, Kingo, who is amazing. I just had great people. I had a great composer, Pinar Topak, does Marvel movies. I mean, really, really the top people working who then inspire me and drive me forward. So as I was getting to the end, I'm going, I think I have something. Great sound, great mix, great sound mix. Across the board, it's just first class people. And so it really brought me back to my energy. And my energy began to move from, okay, now I can see, now we almost have enough money. A shout out to like what was the name of the donor, Cassie at Anonymous, came up with money at a moment when I need it. I mean, certain donors, I mean, not to put donors down, a lot of them, whatever, some of the people who also work for the donors, work for the foundations, are just awesome. I mean, some people just came through with just, I'm out of money, I don't know what to do. I know the producer is pissed off at the director, but the director wants this, and we need another 25 grand, or we need another 50 grand, whatever. And people came through at the last moment. I mean, literally 1.3 days when I have to stop anything, and the money came through. So we got that piece done. We got out in the world, we marketed it, began to see it's really impactful, and it sort of begins to ride on its own. We're also seeing that we're starting to impact some major thinkers and major power players in the sector. And not just in the sector, but what surrounds the charitable sector. And as that unfolded, and that really began 3 or 4 weeks into the release of being in theaters with the movie, being at Q&As, hearing really smart people talk, and more waiting for someone to attack it, or me, and not happening. Something very different was happening. So beginning to understand, okay, there's a mainstream, there's an audience, there's an important job to get this out to the people who work in the sector, but there's this other piece of very powerful. They're powerful people, they're rich people, they're smart people. Sometimes they're combined, sometimes they're not. But it has hit a chord, which has now made me grow clearer and clearer about what is the movement. What's the worldwide global movement that goes from a movie that cost, ultimately, I think, like $1.5 million to make, a lot for a documentary, another $500,000 to market, because this was a hard movie to market, and it'll be more still, to thinking about raising 10, 20, $30 million to change the sector. And that's nothing in comparison with, as I start to understand it, almost $1 trillion sitting on the sidelines for whatever reasons. So how do we unleash it at a time when the planet is at real risk? And what became clearer and clearer to me, and in a way, I'm outside the box. So I can kind of be floating around out here to maybe see, you must listen really carefully, because I love doing interviews. I love talking with people. You learn everything. I'm the dumbest person in the room, so tell me what to say. So you kind of go. So what I have learned is, well, there are 3 sectors that make up society. You can go much further than that, but in terms of there's 3 sectors. There's the for-profit sector, worth trillions of dollars, UK and the United States, whatever. And then you talk worldwide, you're talking about massive amounts of money. There's governments, also access with taxes and everything else, a lot of money. And there's the charitable philanthropic sector. Those are the 3 legs of the stool that make up, I think, the engine that is capable of bringing about the change that is needed. Somebody said to me, the UN had done a study that to solve the major problems is going to take $7 trillion, but needs to be used correctly. $7 trillion. Actually, when you look at all the money, and I've gone from, can you get me 25,000? Can you get me 5,000? Give me $1,000 to going, now let's talk about $1 trillion, which is the amazing thing that a movie can do. It's amazing. I mean, movies saved my life. So I understand on some deep psychological level that it does that for other people too. I mean, so it's very exciting what's going on in terms of now we're at a place where, go look at the movie. Now let's talk. So what has emerged for me are the one most malleable sector, most capable of change, is the charitable sector. And the documentary is a tool to begin the conversation. And there are lots of people around this who've been trying to figure it out for a long time. And thank God Dan has been hammering away at this for a long time to really put together an asset that can begin to shake the thing. He, in his book, which I finally read, I didn't read it until he said, I'll make the movie. Then I read his book. and then I learned, okay, this is what this is about. All right. Yeah. One of the quotes in it is Kenneth Galbraith said, when a door is rotten enough, you can kick it open. And that's not to characterize the sector as rotten in any way whatsoever, but nature has done its job, which is what rotting a door is. And we're now at a point when there are a lot of people who've been surrounding the sector, disorganized, trying to figure it out, doing conferences and all of that, who are ready, I think, to go, let's knock this door down and let's really change the sector. So what has emerged for me, and I'm getting more and more confirmation of this, because again, I'm an idiot, and I need to find it from everyone else. Certainly an idiot in this area, less and less an idiot actually. But and so I've been checking this out. The problem with the charitable, so there are three sectors. So let's look at each of them and come up with first actions, first calls to action. Let's get ourselves $10 million and let's attack each of these things. The problem with the charitable sector at its core is no one can assess impact. No one has been able to assess impact. There's no instrument that assesses it. So you got the charity watchdogs. By the way, charity watchdogs, why do we need a watchdog? We don't have a watchdog. So you're going, the one sector that needs, killer dogs is the charitable sector. Anyway, so overhead is what they use, which is ridiculous, which is as the movie explains, it's almost like if you want to have a company succeed, certainly in the for-profit sector, you pay a lot of overhead to get the best people to do it. For some reason, it's not what goes on in the charitable sector, which is essentially a person-driven sector. It's not a product-driven sector. It's person to person helping each other. Anyway, so how do we come up with an instrument, with an organization, with whatever instrument, I like that term, that assesses charities effectively? And I actually talked with a couple of people, again, brilliant people. The thing about brilliant people is they make things real simple. The Mark Twain quote, you don't because you're not from America, but Mark Twain's quote was one of our great writers. I would have made the letter shorter, but I didn't have the time. And it's like, so you need brilliant people. So anyway, so that to me is the core thing to focus on in the charitable sector now. We need a big chunk of money and a pilot program that starts to really look at, how do you impact? And I think one of the keys to it is what Dan came up with was 5 issues, competitive competition, competitive pay, compensation, marketing, really effectively, first class, marketing, serious money for marketing, the ability to take risks without having the attorneys general go after you or the states go after you, whatever, or the federal government IRS go after you in UK, whatever it is, the time to take risks and achieve success, and big issue, money. How do you get capital? How do you get enough capital? So those are in some ways, I think, an important part of it, but we need some experts, people from, Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, brilliant people. Come in and help us a little bit, figure this thing out. So that's for the charitable sector. That's the first thing we really work on. And there's some pieces already in play that are happening around that now. The second one is the for-profit sector. And what I've learned is there's something, and I don't know how much you're into it, called impact investing. And I'm very much in contact with a lot of people now, some of the top people in impact investing, who have been very excited about UnCharitable, but they're really focused on something else, which is to invest in problems, do good, but make money doing it, which they're pretty much in agreement can take care of a lot of what charity was supposed to do, but not all of it. So what Dan sort of talks about, I think it's maybe 6 to 7% of our problems, it's a weird way of putting it, need charity, need donation. They're not going to make profits, not in the short term or in the semi-long term. For instance, homelessness. You're not going to make money on that, except if you get the homeless population fed properly, taken care of properly. As an example, I know in Los Angeles, a friend of mine runs the libraries. The downtown library has every night all the homeless kids going up to the library and leaning against the walls of the library. Why? Because it has Wi-Fi. Those are the kids that are going to change the climate. Those are the kids that are going to solve some of the major problems, because they're the ones that are motivated and capable of solving massive problems because they live them. So long-term, homelessness can pay off really well. And there's short-term things, government doesn't cost, all those kinds of things. But it's it's a tougher one. So impact investing is not going to cover that. It's going to cover other things, climate change issues. It's going to cover a lot of things. So impact investing and how that works and helping that along, and maybe even making a movie about it, which I'm sort of playing with, sort of, although maybe I want to make a TV series. I think that it involves, this is a piece of it. That's that. The third piece, government, we are now involved with a campaign, just starting a campaign, and it'll be involved with this election cycle, but we got to get money for it, to create an Office of Philanthropy in the White House, which the president can do by executive order, which would oversee and reorganize and modernize this diffuse group of departments which keep the sector really held down. Also, it would be true, and we're talking about some of the states already who have even more arduous relationships with charities where you can't use anything for overhead, to reorganize those as well. So those are the three things. And I'm actually working now, just finishing them. You're kind of getting me in the couple of weeks of, okay, now we need to do a pitch deck. Now we need to lay this out. Now we need to raise $10 million. We have nothing to do with the movement, but having to do with the movement. We're organizing with people and trying to put this all together. That's what a movie can do. So that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, really, really interesting to hear. And I think you've covered loads of the questions that I wanted to ask you. And it's really interesting to hear at the end about where things might be going next, and that you're thinking about questions like impact, because it definitely struck me, one of the things about the whole focus on overheads is the other side of that story is the reason people end up focusing on it is because they don't have a better measure. So they just fall back on this crappy measure of overheads. So it's really interesting to then go, okay, so what could be better and how do we make that work? So one thing I really wanted to just pick up on, because I thought it was something that really kind of came through to me in watching the film, is that it's really interesting to hear that your starting point was more the sort of the human stories, and that was the thing that really kind of got you into it, rather than maybe the sort of more technical stuff about, non-profit issues. And I wondered in watching it whether that's sort of the balance that you have to strike all the time in trying to get these issues out to a wider audience, is that you have to have the human story to make it something that, anybody outside of a really small bit of the non-profit sector would want to watch. But is it a challenge in doing that to kind of keep the balance, to make sure you're sort of servicing the issue enough and not just sort of telling the individual stories? Because you're kind of zooming between the micro and the macro. How do you kind of make sure you're doing that when you're putting the thing together?
I made 10,000 errors, endlessly making errors. I mean, endlessly, and utterly appropriately doubting myself through tons of it. And then reaching out to some very smart people who had some very good ideas. One thing I've learned about movies is you have 5 smart people. They all give you different ideas to how to fix it. You're really screwed because it's a mess. But there's a point when 3 or 4 different people start to point to the same problem, you've now narrowed down your 10,000 mistakes to maybe 4,000. So it begins to come together. I don't know what it takes to be a filmmaker. And I think in some ways, maybe that my most interesting filmmaking is yet to come, which is a weird thing to say at 74. But I wonder a little bit now, because it's so much about knowing you don't know what you're doing. And I don't even know what that means when I say it, except I know I don't know what I'm doing a lot of the time. But somehow not giving up, knowing that you just keep going, you just keep doing it. And then the other thing that's true, which is sort of counterintuitive to what I just said, is, and there's a point when you don't finish a movie, you abandon it. You just finally abandon it. But you have to abandon it at the right moment. And it's such a collaborative process, which I love. I am not a genius. And I think my kids know that pretty well, having been around me and with their own work, I think. It's been really, really fun watching Maggie, who's now directing, and really directing on a quantum level. And talking with her. You can't imagine how delightful that is. And Jake too. Although Jake isn't directing yet, I hope he does one day. But I think to talk with, even young filmmakers or even older people who want to be filmmakers or whatever it is, you just got to know that feeling like an idiot is no reason to stop. but listening to other people, it's really hard. And it's taken me, 50 years to get to wherever the hell I am right now. Except, Dan was very important in this process. Pissed me off. Arrogant son of a bitch. Went to Harvard, blah, 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 all these things, but smart as hell. And the key for me was, and he and I fought about the emotional versus the issue, what needed to be said, and fought a lot. And I made certain decisions relatively early on. Where is the entertainment? Where is the entertainment in this? I felt the animation had to be lighthearted. You & Company was brilliant. In, first of all, making very sophisticated but simple looking animation. So it's kind of lighthearted. The animation is lighthearted through the whole thing. And I think where maybe the only real thing I brought to the table in a way was the idea that as I got to know the sector, the people in it and the people who relate to it, there is a feeling of hopelessness, of despair, of it's not going to happen, it's not going to work. In fact, a donor recently said to me, a very, very wealthy donor who has a lot of friends who are billionaires, he said, wonderful guy, who just said, we don't believe it works. He said, we build a building, that's something. But solving these bigger problems, we don't believe it works. And I was talking with him now about getting involved with an instrument that assesses this, because that's the key to all of this. But I felt what I had to capture, I was always nervous about the title UnCharitable, but I think it's correct. I think the people working in this sector are charitable people across the, they're a little bit messed up, I think, give my life to helping other people. It's a little bit like, have your own life too, and all those kinds of things is a little too much self-sacrificing sometimes, but basically good hearts. But what is done to the sector is uncharitable. And the world is uncharitable. As a consequence, I began I say it was 2 or 3 years into it, maybe more, no, it was more than that. I began to go, I've got to get to despair. I've got to take this journey, like any narrative film, to despair, even more than most narrative films. Real despair, which is where the Puritans and the apocalyptic aspect of it and Bosch and all those images allowed me to go to what we know about most movies, which is the future is apocalyptic. The future is, it's going to be horrible. And because you can use movies for free if they're being used for a subject that is not what they're about, which is a relatively new law, and I have a great lawyer, we were able to use them all. And they're beautiful images. You see them on the big screen. It's just awesome. And I wanted to get to despair, really the despair, to then lift us up. And then, of course, we have, shot to the moon, all those kind of things that lift us up to hope. And in a way, once that came into play, that structure came into play, I think I was able to begin to, that was the spine. And it took a while to get to that. Jason Cohen is a wonderful filmmaker, helped actually. Just recently I was talking with him, wonderful filmmaker, who came in when it was going, it's not working, And actually he talked about some ideas and I went, it's fine. And, he's just jealous I'm making this independent movie, blah, blah, blah. And then it was my soon-to-be ex-wife, we're very, very close, very friendly, said, no, you're wrong. I think he's right. And she was right, and I was wrong. That was one of the 10,000 roads I went down. But he pulled back. It was very helpful. Some of the filmmakers were very, very helpful in guiding me, toward a journey that there has to be one person that's running the ship, but you need a lot of people along the way. So I think that spine then allowed the rest of this to come into place. But that spine, like a dinosaur's spine, is what I'm drawing here. There's a lot of vertebra. And it's like, so it took a long time to get that. But man, I got to say, when it starts to happen, all this stuff, and you're in despair yourself, and you're thinking, oh my God, and I don't have enough money, and people are saying I'm an idiot, and they're right, I'm an idiot, and so on and so forth, it's still fun as hell.
Yeah. And I'm guessing in that process of finding what that narrative arc is, that there's a lot of stuff that then you at one point you could have used that gets discarded or doesn't end up being the focus. I'd be really interested to know what there was that kind of got left on the cutting room floor in terms of angles or issues about nonprofits that you thought, this is interesting, but it's just not right for this film, maybe for another film or for a TV show, as you were saying.
There has been an effort a little bit. There's tons of material.
Yeah.
Tons of it, particularly with the documentary. And there's been an effort at times, and I've done some of it, and we'll probably do more, is to go back in and cut little pieces together to go out as sort of satellite pieces to this. And I think it'll happen more and more. We're actually looking at a version of UnCharitable, a shorter version of UnCharitable, and to sort of bring it down into just sort of a biteable thing for people. And I've always felt more and more, particularly in this age, which is what I think is really a quantum age. And when you begin to look at it, we've left the Newtonian age. We're in a quantum age, which begins to be an umbrella that speaks to why social media is what it is, AI. All the things that are going on are the stuff of quantum mechanics, which is that it's not molecular at all. I mean, all the molecular structure, you take electronic telescopes and you go down to quarks and all these things, they're all just the shape of energy. It's all energy. And as a consequence, you don't have to look at things as parts anymore. You see things as something else. So I think we'll come back to many, many parts that were not in the film. I mean, there are a lot of parts that are fascinating. One was Raj Punjabi talked about a study being done, and I have to go back and get the footage, so we didn't use it, which was, how is great change brought about? How is impossible change brought about? The end of slavery, civil rights, even the invention of electricity, Thomas Edison, and then not just the invention of electricity, but it's being spread across the country. There was a great piece that Dan talked about, and we had footage, and we cut it all together and everything about Thomas Edison. I'd sort of forgotten about it, in which he went, can you imagine somebody coming to you and saying, look, there's this thing called electricity, and it really powers things as opposed to whale oil. And we're going to want to put wires all over the country with poles that will get the electricity to everybody. Can you imagine telling someone that and then looking at you and going, you are out of your mind? Well, I mean, even like Elon Musk, whatever anyone thinks of him, the Tesla is, just, I was at the museum the other day, an auto museum in LA. LA has its own auto museum, of course. And there's a whole section on Tesla, and it has headlines on sort of the lights shine on headlines on the floor. And a bunch of them were like in 2009, even 2011, the electric car is a fool's errand, all these things. And you're going, it's so what brings about change? And he talks about it. So there's two of them, actually. There's Thomas Edison's story, which is one wonderful video with footage and everything we cut. Another is Raj Punjabi's study done on what does it cost to really bring about massive change, even safety belts, for instance, some of these things. So it's like, I forget what it is, but I'll throw out some numbers to kind of give a sense of it. It's $3 trillion spent and 40 years. And that brings about impossible change. And you go, okay, so the whole point is, let's find the equation and then start to apply it to these things. Can we end homelessness across the globe? Yeah, it's going to take X amount of money in this, and let's do it. And start in steps and figure it out, I mean, you do look at some of these things. I mean, the computer, what's happened in my lifetime with computers is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
Yeah. And that kind of idea of, I know they talk about sort of moonshot philanthropy and thinking of things on those sort of scale. There's some really interesting stuff going on there, I think. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see if that's something you end up taking forward. I'm aware I'm going to end up taking up far too much of your time, Steve. So I just want to say thanks ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. It's really, really interesting to hear a bit more of the backdrop to kind of how UnCharitable came about and what your plans are for it coming up. Is there any sort of final thoughts on, what your call to action is that you want people to do? I mean, obviously, go out and see the film, and I'll kind of put links to places where people can find opportunities to do that. But what is it that you would want anybody listening who has seen the film or not yet seen the film to kind of think, that's what I'm going to go out and do next?
I think probably the best thing to do is go to the website, sign up, so that you get information as this all moves forward. It will get more and more organized. It's like people say, oh my God, those people, they're just so disorganized. They're so dysfunctional. They've got this whole big thing. They're so dysfunctional. It's hard to do anything, and it's really easy to criticize everybody. And we screw up all the time. But go to the website. If you can work your way through the website, it needs a lot of work. We need like another $100,000 to really shape it for the next stage and move it into this call to action. You can license the film. Go to, and I think it's Dan just wrote me today. It's not clear on the website where they can license the film, and he's probably right. Got to go in and fix that. I've been traveling doing Q&As. I got to deal with that. So, but you can, if you work your way into the website, you can get the film, license the film, and you can work. We work deals. We do whatever. We can set things up in theaters. We can set things up in private events with Roku, this distribution company, great distribution company. It will ultimately be, screening and it'll be streaming at some point and on TVOD and all those things. And I think the other thing is be on the website, get involved with what is a not kick-ass communication yet, although we're now moving social media up a whole nother thing. We're dealing with that, so that you're informed about what to do. For instance, I don't know what would happen in the UK, but in the United States, we want people to start reaching out to those representatives running for office, or they're in office, and start to say, we want some organization done in the government, changing the laws. That's one thing. The other thing is corporations beginning to look at, and we will get more and more informed about it, about impact investing. And then lastly, looking at the charities in your local area, and just sit back in your, in Liverpool and go, okay, let me do a little bit of research, and find out what's a charity, and then go hang with these people. I mean, at one point, just to quickly end it, I was going to make a movie set in Skid Row, the homeless area in LA, for profit. I was going to make a TV series, may still make it someday. So I went down to Skid Row and started interviewing homeless people. What I discovered was, first of all, 40% of the homeless people in the United States are war veterans who were really in war and never got the services they needed. Secondly, everybody had lived almost to a person a more mythical and interesting life than anyone I knew who lived in Beverly Hills, and were incredibly interesting and actually have a community. And there's a lot to learn there. There's a lot to get from what goes on there. So I think try and get, and not do a lot. And when you can go down 10,000 wrong roads or 10,000 times you don't do anything, and then you just do it. And it's like, and it's wonderful. And you feel different and you feel hopeful. That's the key. I think that's the key from this, is just be hopeful. We are going to solve this.
That's a great optimistic note on which to finish. So yeah, just thanks ever so much, Stephen. Wish you all the best with all the plans for the future.
Take care of Liverpool for me.
I will do. I'll look after for you. Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Stephen for agreeing to come on the podcast and finding some time to do that. It was a real pleasure to have a chance to talk to him, a really kind of different perspective from a lot of the ones that I've had on the podcast, and really kind of interesting to hear some of the process behind the film, the thinking behind it, and where it's going in the future. So I hope you find that interesting too. Okay, at this point, we're just going to go into a couple of the sort of mini interviews that I put together, as I say, with people who came along to the screening that I held, just to give a few more thoughts and perspectives on the film, which hopefully will pick up on things that I said at the beginning and the things that you've heard from Stephen, and give you a bit more flavour of things. So let's go into those. Okay, great. So I'm here with Natasha Friend from Camden Giving. Hi there, Natasha.
Hello.
Hi there. And you were at the screening that we had earlier this week as we record this, watching UnCharitable. And just really interested to kind of get your impressions of what you made of the film, what you found interesting, what didn't work for you, what you thought was missing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and it made me think of lots of conversations I've had with very small charities that I work with, and that there is clearly an issue where core costs are not being funded. The the real audience that it probably needs to get to, that film, is local government, is what I thought, in that there was an awful lot of the organisations that we fund are being fairly well funded for their core costs by trusts and foundations, but that's filling a gap where youth services have programmes that don't cover their costs. And so I think that's where it needs to land. My other thought was just sort of some nervousness around, or maybe nervousness is the wrong word. I feel very uncomfortable with the slight implication that the film had that religious philanthropy had led to a sort of less intelligent philanthropy. And I say that as someone that doesn't come to this work with religious motivations myself, but sort of do very strongly believe in there should be lots of reasons people come to this work. And I think I have the joy of working with an awful lot of people whose religious identity is part of this work and who are also incredibly clever and effective philanthropists. And I think for that reason, I probably would be slightly reluctant to share the film onwards in the context that I'm working in, because I disliked that framing. Sort of saviorism had led us, religious saviorism had led us to ineffective philanthropy.
Yeah, and I think that bit about, I mean, it's a very US specific point really about the kind of history of Puritanism and how that had informed philanthropy, which in itself, I think is questionable. I certainly know there are historians who question that telling of how charity developed over there, but equally it was one of those things where I thought, hang on a minute, that doesn't really resonate here in the UK. Yet we still have a conversation about overheads. And so there must be something more to it than that. So yeah, that sort of struck me as slightly odd as well. And I wondered as well, I just wanted to ask, were there, watching it, obviously it's kind of, I think one of the things everybody agreed on that was good is that there's a film that somebody has bothered to make about, charity and philanthropy issues. And that's great because there isn't a lot of that going around. But I wondered if there was any sort of sense from you of, in an ideal world, what would be the issue to do with charity and philanthropy that you'd like to see got across in a documentary?
Oh, if I was to make a film about my opinions, I very firmly believe that decisions around how money is spent, not just by trusts and foundations, but by government as well, should be sitting in the hands of the people who it affects the most. I don't think that because it leads to better decisions, although I do think it does. I think that's because I think it's a human right to have control over the things in your life, and I think it's magical in communities when it does happen on scale. And so I would make an hour and a half long documentary about participatory grant making, and my husband would be surprised I haven't already started plans on doing that. But if anyone wants to do that, then I'd be very up for it. It would probably just be that watched it.
Participatory grant making the movie, be hitting screens, I'm sure, in a few years' time. So, no, I think that would be really fascinating. Listen, great to just get a few thoughts from you. Thanks a lot for your time. Certainly wish you all the best, and I may well try and get you on for a longer conversation one of these days on the podcast.
Lovely. Cool. Thanks, Rodri.
Okay, I'm here with Amy Braier from Pears Foundation. Hi, Amy.
Hello.
So yeah, you obviously sat down with a group of us the other day to watch UnCharitable. What was your take on the film?
I didn't love it. It was very androcentric. There were a lot of male voices, and to be honest, I was kind of amazed that at the end he didn't watch it back and think to himself, where are the other voices? Where are the women's voices? Where are the local communities? It was a lot of old-fashioned imagery of people in Africa having philanthropy done to them, and it certainly, if there's a Bechdel test for documentaries, it simply didn't pass it. There was, I think, one woman was interviewed, but it was just such a male top-down take on philanthropy for someone who is clearly trying to present as a progressive in the field.
And do you think that, because obviously the core argument of the whole thing is this idea about the overhead myth. And I got the sense here in the room that plenty of people sort of fundamentally agree with that and agree there's something important. But do you think some of that other stuff slightly gets in the way of it when you're watching the documentary, of taking that point away?
Yeah, I think he has a very narrow view of charities and what success looks like. And secondly, it was very mixed in with the self-defense and self-justification, and times when he and other people felt they had been wronged by the overheads debate. And actually, there were a couple of case studies in the film where it wasn't just the overheads. There were wider questions about their practices philanthropically. The Coney film, for example, it wasn't just the overheads that caused controversy. And to sort of link that in and be using the film to settle scores doesn't help make your point about overheads.
Yeah, and if you were going to see kind of a different version of this film, or not, somebody else putting the effort into making another film about an issue in philanthropy, what would you like to see that's different?
First of all, more diversity of voices, but I think I would like to see more about, instead of this kind of American tech founders form of philanthropy that you have to be some innovator founder, I would have liked to see more people at the coalface really talking about the grassroots charity work they do, or the reason that their charity exists, the people it serves, the causes they serve, the beneficiaries, and why they need overheads to do that. And I realize that's not as glamorous, and you probably wouldn't make a film of it, which is why we have this film. But I just think it was a very narrow take on the issue.
Yeah, I guess that's the interesting challenge, isn't it? And in terms of what actually makes for a film versus what are the issues that we really need to be focusing on. But anyway, really grateful for your thoughts. Thanks, Amy.
Pleasure.
Okay, great. So I'm here with Angela Kail from MPC. Hi there, Angela.
Hi there, Rodri.
And yeah, you were also at the screening of UnCharitable last week, came to watch that. And yeah, just really interested to get your thoughts, what you made of it, what you kind of found interesting, what worked for you, what didn't work.
Thank you. And thank you for the invite to the screening. I thought it was an interesting film. For those of us in the sector, we've talked about this a lot, but actually on some things we haven't got that much movement. And I was particularly thinking about the point he made about salaries. So he came at this very much from a sort of CEO level point. Why would anyone who's got an MBA from Stanford work in the charity sector? Which I think is one angle of it. But actually, there's a much broader point that's a real issue in the UK charity sector that I don't think we talk about very much, which is salaries are really low. They're not keeping up with inflation. There were more job vacancies last year than there were candidates. People can't work in the charity sector, and that's got implications for a lot of things that we want to do about DEI. And I think that is in some way capped by either the public's attitude towards salaries or funders' attitudes towards salaries. So I think that is a conversation that's worth having. I'm not entirely sure that chief execs is where I start, but I think that the sort of, in effect, cap on chief exec salaries of you will end up in the Daily Mail does lead to a cap on salaries in the rest of the organisation. So that was one point that I was thinking about a lot. And then the other point that really struck home for me was the point that he was making about infrastructure. So again, he was talking about this in terms of advertising, fundraising, marketing. But in fact, I think the point that we're really seeing the charity sector struggle at the moment, or where I see it, is infrastructure in terms of digital infrastructure. So lots of people saying they don't have any of the money that they need to build a website. And, you look at some charities' websites and they are just dreadful. Never mind some of the apps. So at MPC, we've been doing some work in young people's mental health. And obviously, you'll know that because of the huge waiting lists there is more and more people turning towards apps, and most of these are done by the private sector because the charity sector can't build them. They don't have the infrastructure, no one's paying for it. And even if you are lucky enough to get one grant from someone to do a digital app, you'll never get renewal, so you can't keep it up to date. So those are the two main things that I was thinking about when I sort of saw the film. Really
interesting to hear. And I guess the other thing I'd be really interested in is kind of, I've been talking to other people about this. Fundamentally, the fact that somebody has bothered to make a, big budget, kind of good-looking documentary about issues like this is, I think, really encouraging. What if you had the opportunity to kind of push for another issue or a different kind of issue about philanthropy or charity to be at the forefront of that, rather than maybe the one about overheads? What would you think would be something that you would kind of, like to see a similar approach taken to?
Do you know, I actually think the overheads is a really important issue. Like, when people talk to me, I think that's something that comes up. But I think fundamentally, I think there's something about the skepticism that we have around charities that is not great on a long-term basis. I'm often struck when I introduce my job to people, they say, so everyone basically does philanthropy because of a tax dodge. And I'm like, no, it's not a very good tax dodge, if for no other reason. And I think long term, that's not going to be helpful to the sector. So I can't see anyone making a film about rich people, not all tax dodgers. Mind you, I couldn't really see anyone making a film about overhead. So, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so who knows? Yeah, maybe a 10-part documentary series on the streaming service instead. But yeah,
exactly.
Great. All right, thanks, Angela. Really good to hear from you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Ruo Wu and Alison Talbot from Winckworth Sherwood. Hi there to both of you.
Hi, Roger.
Yeah, and thanks very much for finding a quick bit of time to come on. Obviously, you were both at the screening that we held last week of UnCharitable. Just really interested to get people's thoughts and their kind of takeaways on what they found interesting about the film, what worked for them, what maybe didn't work so much, and kind of what they'd like to see maybe in any potential future films that take this sort of thing forward. So, what did you guys make of it?
So I personally really loved the film, and I thought it conveyed quite an important message, especially to the lay community, about the importance of core funding the running costs of charities. Having sort of worked and volunteered in the charity sector for 20 years, especially with my volunteer hat on and having worked on a grants giving charity, I know this point can often be quite contentious and misunderstood. And I've had people, discussions with people who specifically look to exclude charities that have spent quite a lot on administrative costs and core costs, but perhaps not looking at the bigger picture of why it's integral to have the infrastructure in place for the charity to deliver its charitable purposes. So I definitely think for the lay audience, it does convey quite an important message that perhaps does get overlooked.
Yeah, no, it's great. And Alison, what did you make of it?
Yeah, I thought the same, actually. I thought it'd be huge. I would love the thought of it being on a mainstream streaming platform and just getting people talking about engaging with the charity sector and making more substantial donations and really sort of prompting that idea of people being able to own and think about what their donations are being used for. And I think there's a huge value in the film just for that purpose, to really raise the profile of giving. I was really struck by the fact that it was an American film aimed at an American audience and within that regulatory environment. And it would be fascinating to see an English version looking at, because I think there are some similarities in the issues that philanthropists have encountered in the UK, but I think they would be slightly different. And I think our culture of giving goes back 400 or 500 years, but it is quite different from the culture in the US. So although there are similarities, I think that you could start nitpicking over the differences and why this didn't necessarily apply directly in the UK.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess it makes that point that it's almost as a starting point for a conversation. It's a really useful tool, but it doesn't necessarily finish that conversation. And in terms of, thinking about I think one of the things that I got from everyone that I've spoken to was, even if some people had slightly, mixed feelings about some bits of the film, the fact that somebody had made a film and sort of bothered to make a film about these issues and one with such high production values was a great thing. I guess what I'd be really interested in is, are there any other aspects or kind of charity issues that you would really like to see a similar approach taken to? What's the film that you ideally would like to see made about a kind of an issue that bothers you in the charity or philanthropy world?
I think that's a great question. Really for me, it would be a whole series, because I think there are plenty of topics. And I think just talking about the charity sector and the work that it does, I mean, it'd be great to see a series focusing on different sectors and just showcasing the brilliant work that so many of our charities do, because I think people see snippets of it, but I don't think they you might see a short blast of media interest if there is a natural disaster, but you don't really get the full picture of the fantastic work that goes on across the sector in all areas of our lives. And so it would be great to see us showcasing. And then I think there's other issues you could drill down into as well, the benefits of being a trustee of a charity, and really encourage. You could see a film that's encouraging people, but being realistic about the time commitment and the duties and responsibilities that go with it. And I'm sure there's others.
Yeah.
What about you, Ro?
So I think I mentioned this to on the day of the screening. I know you're involved in the Wealth Shared project in Liverpool, where you have 12 strangers gathered together to make a donation of £100,000. So it'd be really interesting for almost this film to be overlaid or superimposed on a real case study, to see, snippets of that discussion of 12 strangers coming together to see what concerns them. Because I would love to see a film that sort of addresses and tackles common misconceptions in charity, whether it's high chief executive pay, conflict of interest, or any issues, especially from the lay perspective. What have people heard, especially from the media, that they think, I better think twice before giving to this charity or for this particular area. So I think anything that sort of addresses bottlenecks or misconceptions, I'd love to see in a film of some sort.
Great, yeah. I mean, both very good ideas, and let's hope that off the back of UnCharitable, there'll be more interest in kind of making some films about this kind of thing. Just remain to say thanks ever so much to both of you for finding a bit of time to come on the podcast. Great to talk, and hopefully see you both again in the future. Okay, great. Well, there we go. That's obviously made for a relatively long episode because I've put together all of those different bits, but hopefully if you've managed to make your way through all of that, you found it interesting. I just want to say big thanks again to, first of all, to Laura Muth and Vitol Foundation for helping to set up the screening in the first place that made all this possible, and indeed put me in touch with Stephen Gyllenhaal. Thanks to Stephen for coming on the podcast. Thanks to Natasha Friend, Angela Kail, Amy Braier, Ro Wu, and Alison Talbot, all for giving up a bit of time to give me some of their thoughts. If you were interested in this, I'll put links in the show notes to places where you can find more about the film and some other things that I've written and other people have written that are relevant. If you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. You can follow me on all kinds of social media. I'm sure you'll be able to find me. If you've got ideas for people I could speak to on the podcast or topics that we could cover in future, do drop me a line. You can find my contact details on the website. And I should say, that's how this episode came about. So it genuinely does work. If you suggest these things, I quite often will follow up on them. Other than that, just remains to say subscribe, tell all your friends about it, leave us a nice review wherever you get your podcasts, and I will see you next time. Bye!